They complain about their burden of work. But are there too many of them? In France, there's an amazing 56 taxmen to look after every 10,000 taxpayers. In England, we trail behind with 34. But in America, there are only 9, and in Japan, 7. Too many taxmen here, too many taxes? Sir William Pyle, the chairman of the Board of Inland Revenue, is not a typical tax collector. Most of his life he's been an ordinary civil servant and taxpayer. He's had a spell running our prisons and then 5 years as the top man at the Ministry of Education. 2 years ago, he became head of the Inland Revenue. So, William, would you explain to me to begin with what it means being chairman of Inland Revenue? What do you have to do and how vast is your empire?
Well, I'm the, I suppose, most senior, the chief official of a department with about 85,000 staff. The board of Inland Revenue, which I'm chairman, is composed of other senior officials. We don't operate as a board. It's a very important concept, the board. It's a legal concept on which Parliament conveys powers and duties. The main duty on us as a board is the care and maintenance of the taxes, which really means that personal tax affairs of companies or individuals stop with us. Ministers or Parliament can't interfere there. But in the matter of tax policy and legislation, that, of course, is entirely a matter for ministers and Parliament.
Well, let's talk about this pretty vast staff of yours. You've gone on record as saying that they're overburdened with the workload, right?
Well, they've had a very testing year. I expect they would say they've had a hell of a year. Shall I tell you why?
Yes, please. Do you mean all the budgets and so on?
Well, I think you've got to look back a bit longer than that. Over the last 10 years, there have been 1,000 pages of tax legislation. That has brought more change and more complications to the taxes than in any other comparable period. If you look at the pattern of taxes, surtax was abolished and unified with the income tax. Corporation tax was substantially reshaped. A completely new capital gains tax was introduced. Capital transfer tax, particularly with gifts in life, has been introduced. On top of that, these have been the years of inflation and growing unemployment, and that has meant that not so much that more people have come into tax, but more and more people come in and out of tax, and incidentally in and out of benefit, cash benefits, and the collision between the thresholds of benefits and taxes is a serious one. But there have been more people coming in and out of tax, and more people getting higher up the tax net into the higher reaches, which are more complicated to administer. Now, it's against that background that you've got to look at what's happened this last year.
Wasn't there some talk of them going on strike?
Yeah.
There might have been loud cheers from
there
the
was,
populace.
yes. It's an absurd idea of the taxmen going on strike. Yes, they had to do 3 budget operations instead of 1 this year. And although we were relieved of having to tax the increases in national health, national insurance pensions, that's for about 2 million pensioners, we had instead, because of the dramatic fall in interest rates, to redo the allowances for 4 million mortgage holders. And anybody looking after a staff of 85,000 in 1,000 local offices, I think has got to be concerned that their job is constructive, rewarding.
How was the strike averted?
Well, by jolly good industrial relations. There was a lot of plain speaking on both sides, but a lot of common understanding. The government understood the burden that is on these chaps. They too understood in the end that they really ought to carry out this budget work and that they had to take account of the government's current pay line. And I think the real victor in this has been good industrial relations.
Fine. And looking on the bright side, if there is a bright side to tax, it does mean anyhow that these rebates that Mr. Healy has promised will get there before Christmas now, or most of them.
Yes.
Good. Now, this overburdening of work, we have, according to the statistics I read, more tax gatherers per head or per 10,000 than, say, even the United States of America. Is that true?
No, we have this. Yes, I suppose that's true, but it's highly misleading.
Because of a different system of self-assessment and so on.
Yes, and it's commonly said that it costs us in this country £2 to collect £100 of tax, and that in America it costs £1 to collect £100 of tax. But of course the systems are totally different. In the American system, 80 million taxpayers have an enormous input. They have a huge 50-page booklet to complete. Every year, every single taxpayer, half of them have to pay about $1 billion, or what's that, 500 odd million pounds, on top of the cost of the Inland Revenue Service. Those are not taken into account. If you did, it would be £1.6. And the other half of the 40 million taxpayers do it for free, and that's not costed at all.
All right, well, let the Americans worry about themselves, and we'll get back to ourselves here. What about your system here now? How can it be simplified? I mean, is the system up to date, or do you have problems of not being up to date?
Well, some simplification is being done. Child tax allowances are being moved out of the tax system, and we hope to do the same for life insurance premium. But before you ask, can we have more simplification, I think we ought to ask, why have we got so complicated a system? And it is because the UK tax system preeminently is very finely tuned to the pursuit of fairness. Every tax relief and every tax restriction, relief introduced to ensure fairness and restrictions to avoid unfairness, is a complication. I think it's not impossible. It's not impossible to say that you can't really have fairness and simplicity combined in a tax system.
But what I was thinking of more was the way, the conditions under which your taxmen work.
Well, if you have a complicated system, our taxmen have more and more that they have got to learn, and the taxpayer has more and more that he has to bother about. Certainly, if you want simplicity, I think you've got to accept a rougher system, fewer reliefs, fewer restrictions, and if there were common acceptance of that by the public and by our political masters in Parliament, then I think a very real measure of simplification could be achieved in the personal tax field.
Well, if the personal tax was lowered, which we'd all hope for, and if indeed it was simplified, you come down to what's known as the element of personal choice. Do you have a view on personal choice in taxation?
What do you mean by personal choice?
By if the tax rate, I try to simplify, is lowered, you have more money in your pocket to decide where to spend them.
Well, you obviously have.
Yes, but I mean, you're still going to be taxed, depending, but
Oh,
you
yes.
choose to be taxed.
Well, there's no prospect of abolishing taxation.
Is there not?
None whatever, I would say, alas.
But what about, do you think it would be better to put the emphasis on the personal choice or not?
This is the proposition that you should tax on what you spend and not on what you earn. Well, there are possibilities there. You would have to shift the burdens from direct taxation to indirect taxation and put it on consumption expenditure.
But in the present system, would you not agree that we are overtaxed?
Well, I don't think my own views are all that important, but I have remembered what the Chancellor himself said, and if I may, I'll just read it. It's only a word or two. It's rather important. He said in the March budget, the level of income tax is already dangerously high and is already doing real damage to our economic performance, particularly through its effect on those at each end of the earnings ladder. And I think one remarkable thing over the last 18 months or so has been, I think, almost a consensus view that we have, for one reason or another, come to overtax ourselves.
And yet we continue to overtax ourselves.
Well, the Chancellor has done several things in recent budgets to ease the burden, and says that he hopes to do more.
One of the much publicized side effects of overtaxation, or lack of incentive, lack of reward, whatever, means that we have tax refugees, tax exiles. And I don't just mean Rod Stewart or Jackie Stewart or Tom Jones, a lot of reputable businessmen who seem to run away because of this system.
Well, some do. I don't think either the pop singers or the runaway businessmen are the important part of this. I think much more important is that large British enterprises with overseas interests and activities are sending senior staff and people seeking exports abroad, and if they are there for more than a year, they are relieved of UK taxes, they feel the difference, and they are rather disinclined to come back. Now that is, I think, quite serious, and companies are having some difficulties in planning the deployment of their staff because of it. And I think account's got to be taken of that.
But we do have big businessmen from time to time saying we're in a society of no reward, no incentive for extra work because of taxation.
Well, I think it's not only big businessmen that are tending to say that. I mean, that is the consequence, I think, if you do generally believe that we've come to overtax ourselves.
Well, I know that it's not your business to decide what kind of taxes, but to interpret what's decided by governments. By and large, do you feel that tax is gathered efficiently in this country?
I think it's astonishingly efficient, what is achieved. PAYE, which is 3/4 of the total taxes the Inland Revenue collects, between 98 and 99% of that is collected in the year. Of the other quarter that we collect, 96% is collected a year after the year in which the tax is assessed. Of the remaining 6%, 5.5% is being appealed, so we can't collect it, but will collect a good deal of it. And that means over the total field, we fail to collect about 1/5 of 1%. That's 28 millions out of, in the year I'm talking about, the last available year, a total of 14,000 millions. And of that 28, about 12 is because people didn't have the money to pay us through hardship or bankruptcies, and the remaining 16 were people who'd gone abroad or whom we'd not been able to trace in this country. I think those are very, very small figures.
In the pursuit and the achievement of this success, do you feel the pursuit has been too ruthless, too hard on the taxpayer?
No.
I suppose you couldn't very well say yes, but there have been people who feel that the system has refused to take allowance for their hardship or extenuating circumstances or the whatever.
I think we have a very mild tax enforcement system. You compare it with the United States. There, every single taxpayer has to fill in a very complicated form, and he's given 3.5 months in which to do it. And if he doesn't do it, there are automatic penalties. 5% of the tax per month, up to 25% if you do not make a return. And if you haven't paid the income tax after 3.5 months, then you're chargeable at 0.5% a month, up to 25%. These are quite draconian sanctions which are applied automatically. We do not have that. Ours is a much milder system, and I believe a much more civilized system.
All right, let me ask you one other question, Sir William Pyle. What about the two famous words in taxation, avoidance and evasion? How does that impinge upon your world?
Have you got another half hour? Well, I'll try and define the difference between them. Evasion is technically fraud, willful default, or negligence. Fraud is telling us lies. Default and negligence in the main means you're not telling us anything. Silence. So if you don't send in your return, or if you knowingly put down a wrong entry, that's evasion, not avoidance. The real difficulty is to define what avoidance is and the boundary between that and compliance. This is difficult because it's not just a matter of legality. It does introduce moral and, if you like, philosophical considerations, so it's much more difficult. And some avoidance is not objectionable. If you move some of your investments, say, from government securities which do pay tax to, say, national savings certificates which don't, that's a perfectly respectable form of avoidance. But it's when you are dealing with more complicated systems of avoiding tax that I think the moral issues arise. I'll give you 3 sort of tests. They're not exclusive, but the first is to say, is this transaction really being carried out for commercial reasons or principally to avoid tax? Secondly, how artificial is the arrangement? If it's only slightly artificial, it's likely to be the less objectionable. If it's highly artificial, and some of them are extremely artificial, then it is more likely to be objectionable. And thirdly, how far does the transaction succeed only because we've not been told the whole truth? Would it fail if we were told the whole truth? Now, if you use those 3 tests, which are lay tests, they're not highly technical tests, and apply them in any one case, and if you fall on all 3, you can be fairly sure you're offside in the avoidance game.
Sir William Pyle, thank you.
Thank you.